the medieval equivalent of a nuclear holocaust, the Bubonic Plague, or Black Death, killed as many as 1/3 of Europe's people from 1347 to 1350. Today, we're going on a journey back to the Middle Ages. But before we begin, please comment where you're from and what time it is for you. It's always exciting to see where everyone is joining us from tonight. Ready? It begins with the first cough. You awaken in the dark, the kind of darkness that's more than just the absence of light. It's a weight. It presses against your eyes and your chest and your lungs. Something isn't right. You try to swallow, but your throat is dry and sticky, like old glue left in the sun. A cough claws its way up from somewhere deep, somewhere wet. You sit up slowly on your straw mattress, the cough echoing off the low beams of your thatch-roofed home. Your family stirs around you. They're packed in like cargo. Mother, father, siblings, the neighbour boy whose parents died last harvest. No one speaks, but they hear it, that sound, that cough. You whisper a prayer, not because you believe it will help, but because it's what people do when they're afraid and can't say why. Outside, dawn hasn't broken, but the chickens have. A thin, rasping sound, more hiss than cluck. Even they sound ill. You pull on your tunic. It's damp. Not from washing, but from the sweat you left in it yesterday. Maybe the day before. You can't remember when you last washed. No one really does. The village well has been low since the last rain refused to fall. The ache in your limbs is familiar. That's nothing new. But the pain behind your eyes, that's new. A throb like a drum played badly, over and over. You tell yourself it's the cold, or the smoke, or the mould that grows under the rushes in your hut. But you already know it's not. In the far distance, the chapel bell rings. It's not a call to prayer. Not this early. It's a different tone. A flat, slow toll. A death bell. It always rings before the priest arrives to say which house he won't be entering. Because the priest doesn't go in anymore. Not since the sickness. Instead, he sprinkles water from a safe distance, mumbles Latin with his face turned away. And if he leaves quickly, people say it's because he has a stronger sense of smell. Not because he's afraid, but everyone knows he's afraid. So are you. Your mother stirs beside you. She's already awake, already watching. She doesn't speak, just touches your forehead and nods, as if confirming something she didn't want to believe. She pulls the wool blanket tighter around your shoulders. That's how you know she's worried. She's giving up warmth she can't afford to lose. And then she does speak. Don't go outside today, she says, but it's not a warning. It's a goodbye. The morning is grey, not cloudy, not overcast. Grey like wet wool left in a forgotten corner. A colourless kind of light that makes everything look tired. You sit by the hearth, watching the smoke curl upward in a reluctant spiral. The fire is low, it has to be. Wood is too precious for roaring comforts. You sip something from a wooden bowl. It tastes like boiled regret and old weeds. Your mother brewed it last night. Nettles mostly. Maybe some wormwood. It was supposed to settle your stomach, or your lungs, or maybe your soul. The herbalist swears by it. The herbalist lives on the edge of the village, just past the dead oak, where the road begins to forget itself. Her name is Mags, though you've never heard anyone call her that to her face. Just her or that woman, or sometimes witch, if no one religious is listening. She's older than she looks and smells like every herb that ever dried wrong. She came by yesterday. She always knows. There wasn't a summons. No one sent for her. But she arrived anyway, barefoot, with mud on her hem and a bundle of leaves tucked into her belt like weapons. She touched your hand, looked into your eyes, said nothing. Then she muttered something about the wind and left the herbs on the table. Boil these, she told your mother, and keep the smoke thick. So now you sit in it, a stew of smoke and damp straw and the sour steam of a potion no one really believes in, but everyone drinks anyway. Because what else is there? The priest won't enter. The steward won't stop. The gravedigger only visits when the bell tolls. But the herbalist comes. Always barefoot. Always without asking. Outside, the village moves slower today. People pretend not to notice your window is shuttered in daylight. They walk in wider circles, speak in lower tones. Children are kept indoors. Chickens wander freely. A sparrow lands on the sill. It chirps once, then twice, then flies off. You try to feel something about that. Hope, maybe. But mostly you feel tired. The bowl is empty now. The ache in your chest has not changed. You set the bowl down and wait. The shutters are closed, not just yours. All along the muddy lane that barely deserves the name, windows have been darkened, doors unlatched only from the inside. It's not storming. It's not Sunday. But the village knows. It always knows. The air has changed, not in temperature, in intention. It feels heavier, like it's waiting for something or someone, or the next breath that won't come. Outside, the priest passes by. He doesn't stop. He doesn't knock. He makes a mark on your door in ash, just a line, a warning, or maybe a prediction. You don't ask what it means. You already know. Inside, the fire has burned down to coals. The smoke is thicker now. It hangs low, mixing with the scent of boiled herbs and something sourer, older, the scent of breath that doesn't belong to the living. Your sister, Isabel, though no one's called her that in weeks, sits by the wall. She hasn't spoken since Candlemas. She watches the hearth like it's telling her something. Maybe it is. She has the same cough. Your father is gone. Not dead. Not yet. Just gone. Left in the night with the ox and a borrowed cart, muttering something about finding salt or soap or salvation. No one believed him. No one stopped him. You hope he made it past the river, but you doubt it. The house creaks, not from wind but from weariness. It sags under the weight of sickness and silence. The rushes on the floor have turned grey with use, trampled into a second skin that softens the footsteps of whoever still dares to walk. You don't walk, you lie down. The straw bed is damp again, always damp. You shift and the cough stirs, deep in your chest, like an animal that's been sleeping, but not gone. You wonder briefly if it's time to stop drinking water. But thirst doesn't wonder. It demands. You sip from a wooden cup that tastes like rot. The water has been boiled twice. Still it smells faintly of onion and regret. You drink anyway. Outside, the sound of hooves. Not fast, not fleeing, just steady. Someone riding through, not stopping. That's worse. If they stopped, it meant they had somewhere to go. If they're riding through, it means they've already lost it. You close your eyes and listen to the house breathe. It starts small. A tenderness beneath your arm, just where the fabric of your tunic rubs with each slow movement. At first you think it's a bite. A louse perhaps, or a boil. You've had both. You've had worse, but it grows. By midday the swelling is undeniable. A hard, angry knot that pulses with each heartbeat. The skin over it is red, hot to the touch, as if your body is trying to smother something with fire. You press a cloth to it. The cloth comes away damp. You don't remember sweating. You don't tell your mother. She already knows. The hearth glows faintly. The stew, if you can call it that, has reduced to a paste of barley and yesterday's breath. No one eats it. No one has the strength to lift the spoon. In the corner, your youngest brother cries without sound. His eyes are glassy. He's stopped sweating. That's not good. Your mother places a sprig of rosemary beneath his blanket. Not because it will help, but because it once did, for someone else. Maybe. The day passes like syrup poured over cold stone. Slow, thick, inevitable. Light seeps in through the shutter cracks. Dust floats in it. Even the dust seems tired. A knock at the door. No one moves. The knock comes again. 3 times. Software? As if even the visitor is afraid of being heard. Your mother rises, slowly, like a tree bending in wind. She opens the door, a crack. Enough to speak. Not enough to invite. Words are exchanged, hushed and urgent. You hear one name, Tom, then another. Gone. She closes the door without saying goodbye. Tom was the elder. If he's gone, there's no one left to pretend this is temporary. His goat bleated all night last night. You thought it was hungry. Now you understand it was morning. You try to sleep. You fail. The node has grown larger. It has a name, you realise. You'd heard it whispered months ago when the merchant's son died on his feet, his neck black as coal. They called it a bubo. You wonder when the fever will start, and if you'll notice when it does. The heat comes not from the hearth but from within. It arrives stealthily, like a thief at dusk, slipping past your lips, into your throat, and spreading outward until your limbs feel foreign and your bones hum like taut strings. You are sweating, but the sweat does not cool you. It clings sticky and sour, soaking your wool blanket until it weighs like wet clay. You toss it aside, instantly regret it. The air is ice, your body is fire. You shiver while burning. The bubo under your arm is the size of a plum now. It throbs in rhythm with your heartbeat, a steady reminder that something inside you is expanding, blooming, festering. You can't move your arm anymore, not without pain, not without dizziness. Voices drift around you. Your mother, the herbalist, a third you don't recognise. They speak in tones reserved for deathbeds and childbirth. Urgent, reverent, resigned. You catch fragments. He started the swell. No blood from the nose yet. We can still poultice. Then a long silence. Then, we should call the priest. But there is no priest anymore. He left 2 weeks ago, after the miller's wife coughed on his boots, rode out on a borrowed horse and didn't even bless the village on his way through. His door was locked, his chapel cold. The bell hasn't rung since. Someone touches your forehead. It feels like a cloth soaked in creek water and willow bark. It smells like thyme. You remember thyme. It grew near the pig pen. Before the pigs died, you drift. The room twists at the edges. The thatch roof opens to stars you've never seen. Your sister is floating above the hearth. She's holding a loaf of bread and crying. The bread is full of teeth. You open your mouth to speak. A fly lands on your tongue. Darkness again. When you wake, it's not morning, just a new shade of gloom. Your mother is asleep in a chair, upright, snoring gently. Her fingers twitch in her lap, like she's dreaming of sewing or praying. The bubo has burst. You feel it before you see it. The warmth, the wetness, the awful looseness of skin, peeled back by something that wanted out. You look down. The cloth is red. No one told you the plague smelled like iron. Morning comes late, not with light, but with movement. The clatter of hooves on wet earth, the murmured prayers of a neighbour, the distant ring of a bell that no longer belongs to a chapel. Then the real sound, leather, heavy, slow. You hear it before you see it. The door creaks open, not all the way, just enough for the figure to pass through, bending slightly to avoid the low beam. The room, already dim, seems to darken further when he enters, the plague doctor. His coat is black. Not the black of fine cloth, but the oiled, tarred black of boiled leather. Waterproof, bloodproof, and just barely human. It creaks when he moves, as if protesting each motion. It is stitched with wax thread and sealed at every seam. His boots are heavy, his gloves tighter than skin. And then the mask, a long curved beak, pale, porcelain or bone or painted wood, depending on the village, depending on the wealth, depending on the death rate. Twin glass eye holes, thick and misted, hide his face. You can see only the reflection of your own swelling cheek. In the beak, herbs, lavender, mint, rose petals, sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges, sometimes camphor. Today, it smells like rotting sage. Not because it helps, because it hides the smell of you. He doesn't speak at first, just nods, slightly, and kneels by your side. He pulls a bundle from a leather satchel. The satchel contains no miracles, only tools, a wooden probe, a scalpel, dull scissors, a vial of mercury. He lifts your arm gently. The pain is unimaginable. The burst bubo oozes something that should not be yellow. He doesn't flinch. He dabs it with a cloth soaked in wine. Not to cleanse, to numb. Barely. He says one word, quietly, like a sentence already sentenced. Confirmed, your mother whimpers. Not for you, for herself. Because it means quarantine. Because it means no one will visit now. Not even Mags, the herbalist. Because a mark will be carved outside the house. He produces a chicken, alive, feathers missing, eyes dull, a hen that should have been soup. He presses it gently to the wound, ties it in place with a strip of cloth, mumbles something in Latin, half blessing, half apology. The chicken twitches, then stills. The doctor stands. He does not wipe his gloves. He does not touch your mother. He simply turns. At the door, he pauses, scrapes something into the wood with a knife. You cannot see it, but you've seen it before. A cross, a line, a circle. Different doctors mark differently. Then he is gone. And the room is full of feathers and the smell of old sage. The mark remains. Even after the doctor is gone. After his boots have vanished into the slush of the path. After the wind has scattered the last of the feathers. Still, it remains. Carved into the wood beside the latch. A crude sign, not elegant, but unmistakable. In this village, it's a circle with a slash through it. In others, it might be a red cross painted in lamb's blood, or a black line beneath the window frame. It means one thing, no entry. It means this house is no longer a house. It is a tomb in waiting. Your mother tries to scrub it. She weeps while doing it. The rag frays, the mark stays, not because the cut is deep, but because the message is, neighbours will not come. Mags, the herbalist, may leave things on the stoop. Herbs wrapped in wax paper. A small loaf of barley bread. Once, even a sliver of soap. But she will not knock again. She knows the sign too well. She's seen it on too many doors. Your sister doesn't ask what it means. She just lies there, eyes fixed on the rafters. She hasn't moved since the doctor left. You don't ask if she's breathing. You don't want to know yet. The hen tied to your arm is dead. You're not sure when. Its claws are limp, its beak half open, its eye looks milky, like it gave up halfway through your fever. The poultice has soaked through. You begin to wonder if that was the point. Outside, the world has grown quiet, too quiet. Even the village dogs have stopped barking. No carts rattle by, no children scream. It's as if the earth itself is holding its breath. In the distance, a bell tolls. Not the chapel bell, the handbell. Someone is walking the edge of the fields with a wooden clapper, calling out the tally of the dead. 1 clap for each house marked. 3 for every corpse left unburied overnight. A rhythmic accounting of disappearance. Your mother kneels by the hearth. She's not praying, just staring into the coals. You realise she hasn't blinked in some time. You close your eyes again. The mark is on the inside of your eyelids now. You see it when you sleep. The bell sounds again the next morning. Slower now, less certain, as if even it is tired of its own toll. You've lost count. 3 claps, pause 1, then 2. A longer pause, then 5. It takes time to learn the new language of mourning. Each village invents its own dialect of despair. In yours, 3 claps is a house emptied. 2 means a child. 1 is someone still alive, but expected to join the count before nightfall. No one confirms this, but everyone agrees. The bell ringer is a boy, maybe 11, maybe younger. No one knows his name. His family died last week. Since then, he's taken to walking the perimeter of the fields with the clapper. He doesn't speak, just rings, eyes forward, barefoot. They say he never eats. They say the sound keeps the sickness away. They say many things. Inside, the fever comes and goes. When it's there, you feel like wax melting in a clay bowl. When it leaves, it's worse. The air is too sharp. Your skin aches with the memory of heat. You hallucinate that the bubo is whispering to you. You believe it. Your mother no longer tries to feed you. The stew is still on the fire, reduced now to a crust at the bottom of the pot. A single rat tried to investigate. It didn't return. The chicken has been removed. Quietly. No one speaks of it. Instead, they bring onions. Whole, raw, buried under your bed. Mag says they draw the poison out. Your mother slices one and places it on the sill. You watch it slowly blacken. You try not to see it as a mirror. Your sister has stopped moving entirely. Her mouth is open. Her eyes are not. You don't ask. Your mother hums an old harvest song while sweeping. There is no dust, but she sweeps anyway. Outside, a cart goes by. Not fast, not purposeful, just creaking and swaying, like the man pulling it has nowhere better to be. Bodies wrapped in cloth are stacked inside, some tied with rope, some not. One hand dangles loose over the side. It twitches, or maybe it doesn't. You blink. The cart rolls on. The bell rings again. It is well past midnight now, though the sky offers no clue. The moon hides, veiled in a smear of ash-grey clouds. The air outside the house is still. So still, it presses against the door, like a visitor, too polite to knock. Inside, the candles have burned low, stubs of tallow curled in their own wax like broken teeth. No one has slept, not truly. You drift, yes. You fall into something that resembles sleep, but it is filled with flickering images of beaks and bells, feathers and fire, a voice you once knew whispering prayers backwards. Your mother sits by your sister's body. Yes, she is a body now. There was no death cry, no gasp, just a soft exhale, as though the air had simply chosen to stop returning. Your mother has covered her face with a cloth, not for modesty, for denial. There will be no priest, no rites. The churchyard is full. The gravedigger came 2 days ago and said there was no more space. He apologised while eating a cold leek and didn't meet her eyes. Your sister will not be buried in sacred soil. She will not be recorded. She will not be remembered outside of this room. Your mother has decided to bury her behind the goat shed, quietly. She hasn't said this aloud, but you can tell. She's already fetched the spade. Her hands are red with dirt and cold. In the corner of the room, your brother begins to cough. It's not a new cough, but it is louder now. He pulls at his neck as if something there itches from the inside. He doesn't cry, he just coughs, and watches the ceiling with the blank, exhausted awe of someone seeing stars for the first time. The mark on the door is darker now. Someone has added to it. A smear of black pitch, a new line, a symbol you don't recognise. You think it means, don't bother. The bell does not ring tonight. Even the boy must rest. Dawn doesn't come so much as it uncovers itself, like a stain lifting slowly from wool. Grey light seeps through the slats in the shutter, touching the rafters, the hearth, your sister's covered form. The cloth has fallen from her face in the night. No one replaces it. Your mother is outside now. You hear the sound of the spade before you see her, a dull, wet chock of wood into earth. The ground is stiff. Not frozen, not yet, but reluctant. It yields in clumps, pulling up the roots of weeds that died weeks ago. She doesn't cry, she doesn't speak. Each shovelful lands with the same sound. Earth on canvas, earth on cloth, earth on memory. No one helps her. Not because they do not care, because they cannot. Your brother sleeps, if it can be called sleep. His breath rattles like beans in a tin. His eyelids flicker. He is dreaming, perhaps, or wandering. You are left with the silence and the smell. The bubo under your arm has dried to something leathery. It itches now, a deep, sour itch. You do not scratch it, you know better. The last time you tried, your nails came away dark. Your mouth is dry again. You call for water. Your voice does not come. Instead, your mother returns, mud to her knees, hands trembling, a smudge across her cheek where she brushed away something too tired to be a tear. She washes her hands with the last of the boiled water. No soap, just ritual. Then she kneels beside the hearth and begins to sing. A lullaby, not for you, for herself. It is the same one she used to hum when the wind rattled the thatch too hard and the goats cried in the dark. It means nothing. It means everything. She hums until the sun climbs over the distant tree line, until the room is full of light, until your brother stops breathing. He is still when the sun is highest. Your brother. The cough stopped some time ago, and with it, the sound of his turning, the little rustles he made when he tried to scratch without moving. Now, there is nothing, not even breath. Your mother checks with 2 fingers, gently placed below his chin. She does not sigh. She does not weep. She simply stands and leaves the room. The same spade waits, leaning against the side of the goat shed. It is still streaked with dirt. She does not clean it. No one comes to help. Again, there are no neighbours now. The last family, the blacksmith and his daughter, boarded their house from the inside 3 days ago. The fire in their hearth hasn't smoked since. You lie on your side. The bubo has flattened but not healed. Your sweat has returned. Your mouth tastes of rusted coins. You think, perhaps, you've bitten your tongue in the night. Or maybe something else is bleeding. Your mother digs the second grave near the first. This one is smaller. She takes her time. Not because of grief, because the soil here is thicker. It clings to the blade and refuses to release. Worms rise with each stroke, confused by the light, twitching as though they, too, know something is wrong with the order of things. You do not see her carry him out. You hear it. A shift of straw, a creak of the door, a single gasp, not from her but from the cold. Then the door closes again. When she returns, she washes the spade. This time she scrubs it. She sets it beside the door. Then, for the first time in days, she looks at you. Truly looks. She kneels, places her hand to your forehead. You flinch. Her skin is cold, colder than yours. She smiles, just slightly. A strange, quiet smile. Still here, she says, and then, I'll make more broth. You do not know if she means it. You do not know if she believes it. The broth never happens. Your mother opens the cupboard and finds only bones, clean, sucked dry by earlier desperation. A single turnip sits in the corner, sprouted. It has grown a green tail. It looks more alive than anyone in the house. She places it back and closes the cupboard. She doesn't mention broth again. Instead, she begins to sweep. Not with purpose, not even with rhythm, just motion. Her arms drag the broom across the floor in wide, slow arcs. It kicks up nothing. The dust is long gone. What remains is just the smell. At first you think it's the turnip, then the bubo, then the stew pot, still crusted and unwashed. But it grows stronger, more pointed, rot, not fresh, not flesh, not yet. Something older, wet wood maybe, spoiled grain, or the underlayer of your straw mattress, soaked too many times, with too many nights of fever, and breath and waste. She smells it too. She lifts a rush mat and winces. The smell comes up like steam. She opens the door, lets the outside in. It doesn't help. There are no windows in the house, only a small hole above the hearth where the smoke escapes. Today, the smoke drifts sideways, not up, just across, like it doesn't remember where to go. Outside, the cart returns. You hear it before you see it. It's heavier now. The man pulling it is silent, face wrapped in cloth. A single bell dangles from the cart's edge, tolling with each bounce. He does not stop at your door. He doesn't need to. The mark is enough. The smell is enough. He walks past slowly, eyes forward, hands blistered around the worn wood handle. You wonder if he's counted you already. Your mother sets a pot on the fire anyway. Pours in water, adds nothing, watches it boil. You close your eyes again and dream of digging, of soft dirt, of something wriggling beneath it, trying very gently to rise. You open your eyes before the water boils dry. The room smells like scorched air and boiled nothing. The pot hisses. Your mother does not stir. She sits beside it, chin to chest, arms slack, not asleep, not awake, just still. Something is changing inside you now. The sweat has returned. The fever too, but it no longer surges. It simmers. Deep in your belly, in your spine, behind your eyes. The bubo under your arm has stopped weeping. It is hard again. Shiny, stretched. You cannot lift your left hand. You cannot feel your legs. Your mother looks at you, and you see it. Not fear, not grief, recognition. This is the look one gives to a candle burning low, to a chicken that stops eating, to a patch of mould that won't scrub out of the wall. Acceptance. She places her hand on your forehead. Cool, not cold, just enough to tell her what she already knows. She whispers something, a prayer, a goodbye, or maybe just your name. It is the last sound you hear from her. You drift again. But this time, there is no forest, no grave, no digging, only dark, only the sound of breath that slows, and then stops. Your death is not dramatic. There is no final scream, no flailing, no priest to hear your last confession, no crowd to mark the moment. It is quiet, small, software. And in that way, you're like millions, because what claimed you is not myth. It is not curse or punishment or poison from the stars. It is plague, specifically Yersinia pestis, a bacterium so small it could float on a breath. It lives in the blood of fleas, who ride the backs of rats, who ride the carts, the ships, the grain sacks, the fur-trimmed cloaks of couriers and bishops and beggars. It has many forms. The one you had, bubonic, was the most survivable, but you did not survive it. Others would not survive the septicemic form, where the blood itself turns against the body, darkening limbs until fingers fall off like broken twigs. Others still the pneumonic, which spreads through the breath and kills in a day. Your village will lose 3/4 of its people. Some will die in their beds, some in the fields, some trying to flee, only to spread it farther. No one will record your name, but your story is shared again and again, told in hushed tones in candlelight, in songs, in murals painted on chapel walls, where death dances hand in hand with farmers and popes alike. They will call it the Great Mortality. Later, the Black Death. It will leave fields fallow, cities hollow, churches shuttered. Entire generations will vanish, and yet the rats will remain. The fleas will remain. And somewhere, not far from you, another child starts to cough. And in that soft, wet sound, the whole story begins again. The year is 1347. It begins in the ports. It always begins there. Sicily, Genoa, Messina. The ships come in low on the water, sails slack, flags high, carrying goods, grain, wool, wine, and something else. Something moving in the sacks, something that scurries, that bites. The sailors are already dying. Some are already dead, slumped over the rails, their skin blotched, their throats swollen. Rats pour from the hulls like water, disappearing into the alleys before anyone can stop them. The authorities try. In Messina, the port is closed. Too late. The city sickens within days. Streets that once rang with merchants now echo with bells. Priests walk in circles, muttering Latin through tears. No one knows what it is yet. Some say it's the stars. Others, the wrath of God. Others still, a wind from the east. A corrupt breath of air that poisons the lungs. But it isn't air, it's fleas. By the time the city walls are locked, the plague is already on the road. It rides with travellers, with grain carts, with clergy and criminals alike. The Black Death has arrived in Europe, and it is only just beginning. Florence 1348. Florence is a jewel of the medieval world, bustling, cultured, filled with artisans and scholars and bankers who lend money to kings. Its streets are paved, its churches vast, its markets thick with spice and wool and song. But by the spring of 1348, the singing has stopped. The first signs come quietly, merchants too weak to open their stalls, priests who fail to appear for morning mass. Then the coughing, the swellings, the deaths, bodies lie in doorways uncollected. Dogs gnaw at the edges of humanity. The plague does not politely knock, it kicks the doors in. Giovanni Boccaccio, a Florentine writer, watches as the city he loves collapses. He survives, barely. And later he writes of it. Brother abandoned brother, the uncle his nephew, the sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. Fathers and mothers refuse to nurse and assist their own children. The rich flee to country estates. The poor cannot flee. the doctors die too quickly to be replaced. The city orders that the dead be buried in trenches, 10, 20, sometimes 100 to a pit, sprinkled with lime, covered loosely with earth. A priest stands at the edge and mutters the same words, again and again, until he forgets their meaning. In time, there aren't enough priests. Florence loses more than half its population, but the stories remain. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in Plague's shadow, will tell of 10 nobles who escaped to the countryside and passed the time telling stories. It will become one of the great works of Italian literature. But it begins with death, and a city too full to mourn. In the cities, once the dead become too many to bury, they start to burn things. Not the bodies, though those too when pits are full. But the air. It is the air that people fear, the bad air, the miasma. According to the medicine of the time, disease travels on foul smells. It seeps into the lungs through corrupted breezes, the stink of rot, the breath of the sinful. To survive, one must cleanse the air. So they burn. Bay leaves, rosemary, vinegar-soaked rags, sulphur if they can get it. And sometimes entire streets are filled with the reek of pine and dung, and herbs sizzling in open braziers. Homes are fumigated, streets smoked, churches thick with incense, not for God, but to keep out the plague. And among the smoke, the figure appears. The plague doctor. He is dressed in waxed leather from head to foot, coat, gloves, boots, breeches, hat. But it is the mask that makes him unforgettable. A long, curved beak, stuffed with herbs, lavender, mint, rose petals, camphor, wormwood, anything to mask the stench. The lenses over his eyes are made of glass. His breath fogs them as he moves. He carries a stick, not for walking, but for poking, for examining the sick without touching them, for lifting blankets, for opening mouths, for directing corpses without using his hands. He is both healer and harbinger. Sometimes he carries a book of the dead, sometimes a list of symptoms, sometimes he is paid well, often he is paid with nothing at all. Some are trained physicians, most are not. They are volunteers, convicts, second sons with nothing left to lose. They keep records, tally deaths, mark homes. They do what they can, but they cannot stop it. No one can. By the time the Black Death reaches London in the autumn of 1348, the city is already coughing. News has trickled in, of Florence's silence, of Paris's fires, of the great ships of Genoa drifting into harbour with no one left to steer. London listens, but does not act, until it begins. The first deaths are dismissed: an unlucky sailor, a merchant's son, always sickly, a washerwoman from Southwark who had taken a chill, but within a week the numbers grow, and then double again. The symptoms are unmistakable: fever, vomiting, weakness, and then the swellings, black egg-shaped buboes beneath the arms, at the groin, behind the ears, painful to touch, then painful to be near, and finally, still. The church bells toll until the ropes fray. The graveyards fill quickly. St. Mary's Spital, St. Paul's, the cemetery of St. Bartholomew's, all full. The gravediggers cannot keep up. At first they bury the dead one by one, then 3 to a grave, then 10, then 20. Finally, they give up entirely. Mass pits are dug. Trenches really, long deep gashes in the earth, as wide as houses, as long as the city allows. Some stretch for hundreds of feet, dug by criminals, beggars, men with little to lose. They are paid in food, in wine, in false promises of safety. The dead are stacked like firewood, layer after layer, sprinkled with lime to keep the rot down. Priests wander the rows reading abbreviated rites, their voices hoarse, their incense thin. Some bless with a motion of the hand from 20 paces away. Others refuse to go at all. The smell is beyond description, sweet, sharp, a mix of decay and dirt and human fear. Those who can afford it commission sealed coffins and private chapels. But they too die, and in time their bodies join the others. Linen shrouds give way to nakedness, crosses to anonymity. Names are lost. Chroniclers of the time describe it in stunned tones. The living were scarce able to bury the dead, nor could the priests be found in sufficient numbers to say the masses. The whole world seemed to be turned upside down. And still the city lives. Children continue to play, too young to know the meaning of silence. Traders still shout across market stalls. Bread must be baked, water drawn, rats fed. The rats never stop. In 2013, while building the new Crossrail tunnel beneath London, engineers unearthed one of those pits. It contained dozens of skeletons, stacked, aligned, hurried. DNA confirmed the cause, Yersinia pestis, the Black Death buried for 7 centuries beneath layers of soot and cobblestone and time. But the bones remained, perfectly aligned, waiting. As the plague spreads, the roads grow strange. At first they are choked with carts, nobles fleeing cities, merchants abandoning their wares. Entire households, maids, dogs, wet nurses, bundled into carriages, wheels creaking beneath the weight of linen and fear. They leave in every direction, but all roads feel the same, thick with smoke, silence and dread. Soon the poor follow, on foot, with sacks, with children on their backs, with dogs if the dogs have not yet starved. Some flee to the countryside, believing the air there is cleaner, the people fewer, the danger less. They are not wrong, but they are not right either. The plague follows. In wool, in food, in fleas, farmers abandon their fields, shepherds vanish into the hills, crops rot, orchards bloom and drop their fruit unpicked. The earth becomes confused, ripe but untouched, green but unloved. The price of grain triples, then collapses. Entire villages vanish, not from death, but from departure. Parish records show years with no baptisms, no weddings, no funerals, because no one remained to record them. In England, one chronicler writes, "Sheep and cattle wandered untended through the fields, and there was no one to drive them." And in France, the roads were full of corpses, and the fields grew wild. Lords panic. Without peasants to till the land, manors fall into ruin. Some attempt to bind labourers by law, to prevent them from leaving, to fix their wages. These efforts fail. Survival has no salary. For the first time, the social order begins to shift. Labourers, once voiceless, now hold power. They demand more pay. They move where they are treated better. They are listened to, not out of respect, but out of necessity. The fields remain mostly silent, but in the distance, windmills still turn. And in their slow creaking motion, something new begins to stir. Not hope, but change. Not everyone fled. Some walked toward the plague, barefoot, bleeding, and singing hymns in monotone. They were called flagellants. Their movement began in the German states around 1348, as the death toll mounted and answers fell silent. Churches were full of the dead. Priests were themselves dying, and prayers felt increasingly unreturned. So these men, mostly men, though women would sometimes follow, took penance into their own hands. Literally. They travelled in groups of 50, 100, sometimes more, wearing white robes, hoods, and carrying whips, short leather cords tipped with iron spikes. Twice a day in the public square, they would strip to the waist, form a circle, kneel, and chant. Then the whipping would begin. One would beat the man to his left, then pass the whip. Each man took his turn. Shoulders split open. Blood ran in the streets. They moaned in rhythm. Their songs were long and laced with Latin and agony. The air filled with the sound of leather on flesh. It was spectacle. It was medicine. They believed that sin had brought the plague. That pride and vanity and gold and gluttony had so corrupted Christendom that only self-inflicted suffering could balance the scales. They marched from town to town, drawing crowds. Some welcomed them, others wept at the sight, and some grew suspicious. The church at first tolerated them, then feared them. These were not licensed priests. They ignored bishops. They rejected papal authority. They believed themselves chosen, directly instructed by God through vision, fever, dream. They claimed to heal. they claimed to exorcise, but in truth they spread fear, and sometimes the plague itself. They slept in barns, in stables, in tight quarters. They carried lice, they carried fleas, they carried death. Eventually, Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellants in 1349. He labelled them heretical, banned their processions, ordered them dispersed. Many returned to obscurity. Some resisted and were excommunicated, but the memory remained. And the streets remembered their songs, and the stones remembered their blood. And still the plague continued, unmoved, unimpressed. When death arrives without reason, reason becomes the first casualty. By 1349, as the plague burned through Europe like dry thatch, fear began to ferment into something darker, blame. And soon it had a target, the Jews. Rumours spread faster than rats, that they had poisoned the wells, that they had brought the plague in barrels of fish, that they had made a pact with the devil. None of it was true, but truth is rarely a match for panic. In Switzerland, Strasbourg, the Jews were rounded up before the plague even arrived, accused of spreading it ahead of time. 2,000 men, women and children were dragged to the cemetery, burned alive. The council later declared that it had been a voluntary action. In Mainz and Cologne, the Jewish quarters were attacked. Entire communities wiped out in a matter of hours. Homes were looted, bodies thrown into the river. The Pope, Clement VI, issued a bull condemning the violence. It cannot be true that the Jews, who suffer in the plague like others, are its cause, he wrote. But the bull did little. In towns like Barcelona, Narbonne, Erfurt, Speyer, pogroms erupted. Public burnings, forced conversions, entire neighbourhoods erased. The streets washed with lime afterward, as if that could cleanse what had been done. Some Jews fled to Poland, where King Casimir III offered protection for a time. Many more died. The irony, of course, is that in some places Jewish communities did experience slightly lower death rates because they practiced hand-washing rituals. Because they were often segregated, less exposed, but difference, however slight, can be fatal in an age of terror. And so, as plague devoured Europe's body, persecution devoured its soul. One death silent, the other screaming, both contagious. Before the plague, death was a ceremony. Even for the poorest villager, there was a pattern to parting. The priest would be summoned. The last rites administered. The body washed, hands crossed, eyes closed, wrapped in linen and laid out in the home. Candles lit, psalms whispered, neighbours gathered. A vigil was held, a bell tolled. And then burial, usually by sunset. The grave would be blessed. A cross marked the soil. And prayers were said for the soul's journey. That was before. After the plague came, the rituals broke. There were too many bodies, too few priests. The graveyards filled. The mourners themselves began to die, and what had once been sacred became functional. Families began to bury their own. No priests, no candles, just shallow graves dug by hand. Sometimes in gardens, sometimes in barns, sometimes in the very beds where the dead had lain. The linen shrouds disappeared next, too valuable, too rare. Corpses were buried in old cloaks, in sacks, in nothing at all. Cemeteries overflowed. Trenches replaced tombs. Stacked bodies, sprinkled with quicklime and dirt. The lime burned the flesh, masking the smell, but not the sin. In many places, the church stopped tolling the bells. There were too many names. The silence in the end rang louder. In Avignon, it is said that Pope Clement VI consecrated the entire Rhone River, so the dead could be thrown in and still be received by God. In Florence, bodies were dragged through the streets by cart, a single monk walking behind with a perfunctory mumble. In villages, mothers began to bury their children without names, without songs, without tears, because even grief, when repeated often enough, becomes a habit, a movement of the hand, a sigh, a shrug, and mourning became a luxury, because the living were running out of energy for the dead, and the dead were arriving faster than prayers could be spoken. As the death toll climbed and the churches emptied, people began to look upward, if not for mercy, then for meaning. The Black Death was not just a sickness, it was an unravelling of order, of faith, of the rules that once explained the world. And in the absence of reason, the old stories returned. The sky, they said, had warned us. In 1345, 2 years before the first European outbreaks, a triple conjunction of planets occurred: Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, tangled in the house of Aquarius. Astrologers took note. They wrote in Latin and dread. A great pestilence is at hand. They were right. Others saw omens in the sky itself. Fiery comets, blood-red moons, unusual eclipses, all signs, they claimed, of divine fury, of the world tipping toward its final breath. Some said they saw a rider in the clouds, others a pale hand drawing a veil over the sun, and not just in the sky. On the roads, travellers spoke of monstrous births, children with 2 heads, lambs born hairless, calves with human eyes. These were not rare in truth, but now they were interpreted. Warnings, dreams too took on weight. A farmer near Lubeck claimed he saw the Virgin Mary weeping blood. A girl in Normandy dreamt of saints gathering the names of the dead in a long book with no last page. In Prague, it was said a man dreamt of the end of time, except he did not wake. There were books written, apocalyptic sermons, marching prophets. Some called it the Second Flood, but this time with breath instead of water. And still, the world did not end. It changed. The prophecies faded, the skies cleared, but the idea remained that the Black Death was not merely a sickness, but a message. Long after the coughing stopped, the plague remained, etched not in flesh but in stone. Church walls, manuscript margins, carved beams in abbeys, painted altars. Everywhere across Europe, death had left its mark. But now the living began to respond. Not with denial, not with silence, with images. The most famous of these was the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death. It began perhaps in Paris or Basel, or a dozen places at once, no one knows. But the message was the same. Death is the great equalizer. In the paintings, skeletons dance in lines, bony arms linked with kings, with peasants, with bishops, with infants. They grin, they beckon. They play flutes made of femurs. Some wear crowns, others robes. One always points ahead. Everyone joins, no one escapes. This art spread like a second plague, across walls, down choir stalls, in the illuminated pages of prayer books. It was not macabre in the way we use the word today. It was matter of fact, gentle even, but firm. Memento mori, remember, you will die. The figures are not fearful, they are familiar. Death is not a stranger anymore. It is a neighbour, a partner, a shadow cast by candlelight on the wall of your hut. And so the artists paint what they know. The gravedigger with his spade, the merchant clutching coin, the child with his toy. Centuries passed, the plague faded, the bell stopped ringing, the cart stopped rolling, the trenches were covered over, turned into gardens, orchards, marketplaces. Cities grew atop the bones, and yet the bones remained, in catacombs, in ossuaries, in charnel houses tucked behind forgotten chapels. In Kutna Hora, in the Czech lands, an entire chapel is built of bone. Walls adorned with skulls, chandeliers dripping with femurs, garlands of vertebrae strung like rosaries. It is not meant to frighten, it is meant to remind. Thousands died, but the bones remain arranged, known, seen, held in place by those who survived. In Paris, beneath the cafes and bakeries, the catacombs stretch for miles. 6 million dead. A city of bones beneath the living one. The monks who placed them did so in patterns, rows and hearts and spirals. Because even in death humans arrange. They organise what they fear, and the plague had taught them that death was not to be hidden. It was to be named, faced, lived with. And so they drew skulls in books, hung them in churches, wrote poems to them, carved them into door frames. They didn't forget, they couldn't. Because the plague had left more than graves. It had reshaped the imagination. Every lullaby now had a final verse. Every painting, a memento mori. Every kiss, a potential goodbye. And the bones, they remembered. They remembered the coughing, the silence, the dream of digging, the smell of lime and rosemary, the children who never cried, the priest who stopped knocking, and the door left open, just a crack. The plague did not end with a bell, a cure, or a final grave. It faded slowly, like smoke after a fire, lingering in the corners of cities and the folds of blankets. It retreated, then returned, flaring up in smaller waves over decades, never quite gone, but no longer devouring entire regions at once. And when it finally lessened, it left behind a world that no longer fit its own skin. Europe in the aftermath was altered, not just by grief but by geometry. There was more land than there were people to work it. Fields lay fallow, vineyards overgrew, entire villages, once noisy with carts and cows, stood abandoned. Hollow shells, with no one left to claim them. Forests crept back over old fences. Nature filled the silence. Those who survived inherited not only their neighbours' goods, but their space. A peasant who once had nothing now had land. A craftsman had choices. And in those choices, power shifted. For the first time in memory, labourers could ask for more. Wages rose, demand rose. Feudal obligations, once the bedrock of society, began to loosen. Lords who once commanded now negotiated. The social contract had changed, quietly and without ceremony. Faith, too, had changed. The church remained, but it stood differently, weaker, exposed. During the plague, priests had died in droves, blessing the sick until they themselves collapsed. Some were remembered as saints, others fled, and were remembered differently. The faithful had prayed, and died anyway. Doubt crept in, not as rebellion, but as erosion. New movements began to stir in quiet corners. Heresies, reformations, seeds that would take a century to grow, but were planted in the empty pulpits of plague-struck parishes. Art shifted with the soul. The heavenly was still painted, but now so were skulls. So were dying mothers, hungry children, leering skeletons with fiddles. Painters looked inward. Writers lingered longer on flesh. The human form, once seen as sinful or irrelevant, was suddenly central. Beauty became fragile. Brevity became holy. The Renaissance did not begin because of the plague, but it quickened in the void it left behind. The survivors rebuilt, yes, but they did not return to what was. They could not. The old world had died with the dead. What rose in its place was something stranger, rawer, more questioning. A world where death was no longer a distant concept, but a familiar one. During the Black Death, everyone was in danger, but some were in danger professionally. There were jobs in Plague Europe that required walking directly into infection, breathing it, touching it, burying it. Jobs no one wanted, until there was no choice. Jobs you didn't train for. Jobs that didn't come with safety, only coin. And coin, during the plague, didn't stay warm for long. The most obvious of these was the plague barrier, also called bearers or death carters. These were men tasked with collecting the dead. They walked the streets with wooden trolleys or handcarts, calling out into alleys and under windows. Bring out your dead. Most were poor, many were prisoners, some were merely desperate enough to earn a few pence for each body hauled. They worked in pairs, lifting swollen, leaking corpses by the ankles, and under the arms, stacking them like timber. Their hands, their clothes, their carts, all soaked in the fluids of the dying. They often slept in the same garments they used to haul the dead. If one man coughed, the other would drag him into the next pit. Close behind them came the grave diggers, a profession suddenly elevated to urgency. Pits had to be dug deep, wide, fast. Bodies had to be buried quickly before they burst. The work was brutal. The soil was often frozen or filled with rock. The gravediggers' hands blistered, split, and bled. Some wore cloths soaked in wine over their mouths. Others trusted garlic. It helped little. Then there were the plague doctors, strange figures in long coats and bird-like masks, often imagined as physicians, but more commonly untrained volunteers. Some were students, some were barbers, some were conscripted criminals. They walked among the dying with their beaked masks stuffed with herbs, trying not to breathe. Their job was to diagnose, to track cases, to report deaths, not to heal. Healing was a hope, not an expectation. Washerwomen were also at terrible risk, cleaning the clothes and linens of the sick, boiling them in tubs, wringing them out with bare hands. Infection clung to cloth, to sweat, to the folds of sleeves. A single bedsheet might hold the breath of 3 corpses. The smell alone made some faint. Many died within days of beginning their work. And then there were the priests, men whose task was to comfort the sick, give last rites, enter houses no one else would enter. They laid hands on the dying, kissed foreheads, drank from the same cups, and when they fell sick, as many did, another would be sent, until there were none. One chronicle from London states that entire monasteries vanished. 40 monks, 50, 80, gone, all dead, all buried in the same week. These were the plague's labourers. They were not heroes, though some became saints. They were not villains, though some turned to looting. They were simply those who stayed behind to finish the work no one else could bear to do. Sometimes there was an answer, more often a silence. She would open the door slowly, stepping into homes where the air hung thick with unwashed cloth, spoiled broth, and breath no longer needed. In corners, the sick might still stir. Some would cry out. Others lay still, mouths open, as if to ask one last question they never got to finish. She had to examine the bodies, check for buboes, note blood from the nose or mouth, mark the death as plague or natural, though in those days the difference was mostly academic. Then with chalk, she would mark the door, a symbol of plague, a warning, a record, a guarantee that the body would be carted by dusk. And then she moved on. One house, then another, and another. She was paid by the death. Some weeks were profitable. She did not eat near others. She did not touch. She did not speak much, except to herself. Most searchers died, but a few did not. Those who survived were often outcast, too feared to be welcomed back into ordinary life. They had seen too much, smelled too much, become too much a part of the plague to be separated from it. The records rarely include their names, only their tallies. The searcher was a role given almost exclusively to poor women, usually past childbearing age, often already marked by grief. They were hired by city authorities to confirm plague deaths and report them for record keeping, quarantine enforcement, and burial. The job was never glamorous. It was necessary and lethal. A searcher would begin her day with a list often written in poor script by a clerk who had not left his room in weeks. The list held addresses, suspicions, hints. No contact for 2 days. Coughing heard. Smoke from chimney ceased. Armed with nothing but a piece of chalk, a list, and a handkerchief soaked in vinegar, she would move from house to house. The job was not to heal, it was to witness and to tally. At each door, she knocked. But if you thought being a searcher was bad, what about being a pest house attendant? To work in a pest house was to serve the sick at the edge of the world. Pest houses, sometimes called lazarettos or plague barns, were hastily assembled places of isolation. Churches, stables, old warehouses, wherever walls could be raised and doors could be barred. These were not hospitals, they were containment. The goal was not to heal, it was to remove the dying from the community, and someone had to stay with them. The pest house attendant was usually a man, though not always, with no medical training, little authority, and no protection. Often he was a debtor, a vagrant, or someone caught stealing who was given a choice, the rope or the job. Inside, the air was thick, warm with breath and blood and sweat. Beds were straw pallets on dirt floors. Bodies twisted in fever. Some moaned for water. Others begged to be killed. Others just stared at the beams of the ceiling, waiting for morning. The attendant moved among them with a rag over his mouth and a bucket of vinegar at his side. He changed soiled cloths, burned them when he could. He spooned barley water into mouths too dry to swallow. He dragged the dead from the living. Each night, he pushed the bodies toward the door, where the bearers would collect them at dawn. Sometimes the bearers refused, so the attendant dragged them outside himself. He slept little, ate less, prayed not at all. In some places he was locked in with the sick. The doors were barred from the outside. If he survived, he would be paid. Usually, he did not. When the plague came, it did not come with a cure, so people made their own. The theories of the time were many. Most believed the plague spread through bad air, miasma, invisible vapours, corrupted winds. Foul smells were not just unpleasant, they were dangerous. To breathe wrong was to die. So the first defence was scent. People stuffed their homes with fragrant herbs, lavender, sage, rue, rosemary. They burned camphor, hung oranges spiked with cloves. In cities, carts rolled through neighbourhoods, filled not with bread, but with smoke. Herbs and dung smouldering in braziers to cleanse the atmosphere. Others carried protection on their person. Pomanders, round balls of perfume-soaked wax, worn on chains or sewn into sleeves. Doctors carried posies. Children tucked mint into their collars. One could not escape death, but one might outsmell it. Then there were talismans, rings engraved with protective saints, medallions featuring Saint Sebastian, shot through with arrows but never dead. Some carried written prayers, some swallowed them, ink and parchment down the throat, hoping the holy words might protect the stomach. Quarantine was practiced in crude ways. Ships were made to wait 40 days in harbour before unloading. In Venice, they built islands for the sick. Lazarettos, named for Lazarus, the man raised from the dead. Towns shut their gates. Villages posted guards. Some households sealed themselves inside for weeks, living off onions and salt pork, praying their neighbours died before their locks rusted. Diet was altered too. Doctors warned against fruit, against bathing, against sleeping in sunlight. People were told to avoid sex, milk, pork, strong emotions. Many stopped drinking water. Wine was safer. Some bathed in vinegar, others in urine. Then came the bloodletting. Leeches, knives, heated cups. The idea was to rebalance the humours, draw out the poison. Sometimes it seemed to work. Sometimes the patient simply bled out faster than the plague could kill them. And when all else failed, they fled. To the countryside, to caves, to nowhere in particular. Fleeing the city was common, but rarely safe. The rats travelled too, so did the fleas. And in the silence of the open road, many died without even the sound of a bell to mark their going. No one knew what worked. Some things helped. Isolation, airflow, clean water, but most relied on ritual, rumour or faith, and even the best precautions were undone by a single cough. Medieval medicine was not without knowledge. It had structure, it had theory, it had tradition, stretching back to Galen and Hippocrates and Aristotle. But it was wrong in the most crucial way. It didn't know what disease really was, and so it fought the plague like a shadow, striking at shapes, not causes. The dominant belief was the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Illness meant one humour had taken the upper hand. The plague, in this view, was not a specific enemy, but a disruption, an internal rebellion of fluids. The first prescription: bleeding, leeches, lancets, veins opened with a blade and drained into bowls. Bloodletting was common before the plague, but during it, it became a frenzy. Some were bled until they fainted, others until they died. Still others refused to stop, convinced that each drop drew out the sickness. Cupping came next, glass or horn cups heated and placed on the back to pull out toxins. The skin blistered. Sometimes the blisters burst. The results were inconclusive, but it was something to do. Other treatments were stranger. Boiling vinegar, was poured into the room to purify the air. Patients were encouraged to sit near open fires, sometimes in furnaces, sometimes over cauldrons. The heat, it was thought, would drive the illness out. There were recipes too: dried toad powder, crushed emerald, mercury rubbed into the skin, roasted onions mixed with honey and applied to the buboes, a plucked chicken strapped, alive, to the swelling. It would absorb the poison, supposedly, and when the chicken died, because it always did, another was tied in its place. Doctors who practiced these treatments did so while dressed in leather, gloves, and that unforgettable mask, the bird-beaked plague doctor. The mask was functional, in theory. The beak was filled with strong-smelling herbs. The idea was to filter the air, to block the miasma. It also blocked the smell of death. The goggles protected the eyes. The robe, often waxed, was meant to repel infection. The stick in the doctor's hand? For pointing? For turning bodies? For keeping the desperate at a distance? Did it help? Not much, but it gave shape to the chaos. The medicine of the plague was rarely effective, but it was constant. It was the rhythm of hope in an age ruled by helplessness, and for a time that was enough. When the remedies failed, people turned elsewhere, to the edge of the known, to places where medicine blurred with magic, where the rules bent and the cures came wrapped in secrecy. Not all knowledge was welcome in medieval Europe, and the knowledge that lingered on the outskirts, in the forests, the corners of apothecaries, or behind unshuttered eyes, was both feared and sought. Some of it came from books bound in vellum, written in Latin or Greek, copied by hand and hidden from public view. Alchemical texts, astrological charts, lists of herbs with both healing and harmful properties, mandrake, belladonna, foxglove. There were charms, talismans, pouches to be worn around the neck containing dust from a saint's tomb or the burnt bone of a toad. But some knowledge came not from books, but from people. The old woman at the edge of town, who remembered which roots calmed a fever and which killed a man in his sleep. The wise man who whispered that the stars had shifted again. The woman who knew how to draw protection symbols on the lintel of a door using chalk, blood, or both. These were not doctors. They were cunning folk, witches, wise women, pagan remnants, heretics, depending on who was asked. Some were trusted, most were not. Still, when the priest had died, when the doctor had fled, when the neighbour was coughing blood into the hearth, people came to them. They asked for potions, for poultices, for smoke, for songs, for spells. In some places they were thanked, in others they were burned, not for failing, but for trying too well. The line between healing and heresy was thin. One village's saviour was another's witch. A root that soothed a swelling could also end a pregnancy. A charm that warded off disease could also attract suspicion. But magic persisted, because death did. And when nothing else remained, people turned to what they feared, and hoped it feared them back. The church offered answers, but it did not offer safety. Priests died in their thousands. Bishops vanished. Entire monasteries fell silent, their bells rusting in towers too quiet to be holy. And for many the plague began to feel like something even faith could not reach. Yet belief endured. It simply changed shape. In the face of silence from pulpits, people turned to saints, especially those who knew suffering firsthand. Saints who had been martyred, saints who had survived illness, saints whose bones, sealed in reliquaries behind thick glass, became objects of pilgrimage and prayer. The most famous was Saint Sebastian, a Roman soldier who had been shot full of arrows and miraculously survived. Though unrelated to plague in origin, his suffering resonated. He became the unofficial patron of pestilence, pictured everywhere, pierced but peaceful. His image was hung in homes. Prayers to him were stitched into linens, painted on walls. Then there was Saint Roch, a 14th century figure who, according to legend, ministered to plague victims, caught the disease himself, and was exiled to a forest where a dog brought him bread until he recovered. He became the people's saint, a model of endurance and healing. His image always included a raised tunic, revealing the bubo on his thigh. These saints became intermediaries, not distant deities but suffering companions. Their relics were carried through towns, processions marched barefoot, heads bowed, candles guttering in the wind. Sometimes the saints' bones were brought into infected neighbourhoods, believed to purify the air, to frighten death itself. There were other bodies too, the uncorrupted. Corpses that did not rot, monks, nuns, martyrs, were seen as sacred. Incorruptibility was viewed as proof of holiness, a sign that God had spared the flesh even in death. People touched their coffins, kissed their garments, laid the sick beside them. Faith did not retreat. It rooted itself in the ground, in bones, in memory. And while the church tried to control the narrative, the people made their own theology, one in which death was not a punishment, but a passage, and the saints, wounded and waiting, stood quietly at the door. The medieval world did not know what a bacterium was. They could not see Yersinia pestis, the microscopic killer that travelled in the blood of fleas and rode the backs of rats like cloaked thieves. They did not understand germ theory. They could not name contagion, but they did see rats. Rats were everywhere, gnawing through grain sacks, skittering beneath floorboards, nesting in piles of straw, loitering near refuse in city alleys. They were not feared so much as tolerated, like bad weather, an unpleasant fact of life, not yet seen as a vector of death. But some men noticed more than others. The rat catchers, often reviled, sometimes mocked, rat catchers occupied the lowest tier of urban employment. Below night soil men, below street sweepers. Their job was to hunt vermin, often by hand, often barefoot. They walked the alleys with sacks and sticks, their coats stitched with pouches for bait. Some carried ferrets. Others used small grim-looking terriers, trained to kill without pause. It was dangerous work, not because of the rats themselves, though the bites could be nasty, but because rat catchers were unknowingly walking through infection. The fleas that clung to rat fur did not stay there long. They jumped when the host died, onto skin, into sleeves, beneath collars. The rat catcher was not just handling rats, he was handling plague. Some rat catchers boasted of their skills. They displayed the tales of their kills. In some cities they were paid by the carcass, 1 coin per dozen. Others worked privately, offering their services to wealthy households who noticed a strange scratching behind the walls. There were rumours too, that some rat catchers bred rats, kept them alive, released them near bakeries or cellars just to inflate the demand. A plague profiteer. No one could prove it, but people looked at them sideways, avoided them at market, paid them quickly and from a distance. By the time rats were officially declared a cause, centuries later, it was too late for thousands of rat catchers who had died without knowing why. They had touched the carrier, lived with it, swung it by the tail, and every time they opened the mouth of their sack to throw another rat inside, the plague was breathing with them. No one wanted to be a gravedigger, but someone had to be. And when the seasoned diggers fell sick, and they always did, it was often the youngest, the poorest, or the most desperate who were pulled in to replace them. That was how apprenticeships began during the plague, not with lessons but with a shovel thrust into trembling hands. The gravedigger's apprentice didn't start by digging, he started by watching. Watching how to mark a site with chalk, how to pick ground soft enough to turn, but not so soft it flooded, how to keep lime dry, how to stack bodies efficiently, how to breathe through your mouth when the wind shifted wrong. He learned fast. There was no time for slow understanding. The pits had to be deep, wide, fast. Graves were no longer for individuals, but for dozens. The apprentice often stood waist-deep in a trench, passing up bodies wrapped in blankets or stained linen, some still warm, some already bloated. He learned to tie them by the ankles, to keep them from shifting when the dirt hit. He learned the smell of early rot. He learned what it meant when the jaw hung open, when the belly was swollen, when the blackened fingers curled under as if still reaching. Sometimes he was alone. The older diggers would disappear mid-week, coughing, sweating, eyes yellowed. The apprentice would dig double, eat less, sleep behind headstones, curled like a dog in dirt. If he survived, he might become the next senior digger, but most did not survive long enough to pass on the craft. No one remembered their names, just the rows they filled, the ground they turned, the silence they left behind. And the way, years later, when new construction disturbed the earth, the bodies lay in perfect lines, evidence not just of death, but of a boy who once dug because no one else would. Let's take a brief detour from plague pits and pottage. History, after all, isn't only tragedy, it's also deeply strange. The Middle Ages were not just a time of hardship, but a world full of customs, beliefs, and everyday oddities that now seem almost unbelievable. Let's begin with one of the most shocking. 1. Pigs were put on trial, and sometimes executed in public. In the medieval legal system, the concept of guilt did not exclusively apply to humans. Animals, particularly pigs, could be formally arrested, charged with crimes, and executed. Yes, executed, like a criminal, in public, with a proper noose. The most infamous case took place in Falaise, Normandy, in 1386. A sow was accused of mauling a child, biting it in the face and arms. The child later died. The townspeople demanded justice. The pig was arrested, jailed, tried in a secular court, and provided with legal counsel. Witnesses were called. The pig was found guilty, but that wasn't enough. For the execution, the pig was dressed in a waistcoat and human trousers, in mockery of its alleged crime. Then it was led through town to the gallows and hanged. The spectacle drew a crowd. This was not an isolated incident. Throughout Europe, animals were occasionally put on trial for crimes ranging from theft to murder. In 1474, a rooster was tried in Basel for laying an egg, believed to be the work of the devil. The rooster was burned. Rats, too, were once summoned to court for stealing grain. When they failed to appear, the court graciously acknowledged the dangers of travel and offered them a postponement. The reasoning? Animals were considered part of God's creation and thus subject to divine and human law. In an age that believed everything had a moral dimension, even a swine's misstep could be viewed through the lens of sin. It sounds ridiculous now, but to the people of the time, it was justice, visible, public, symbolic, and very, very serious. Medicine in the Middle Ages was deeply intertwined with astronomy. Not astrology as we casually understand it today, but a complex system of planetary influence that dictated when it was appropriate to treat, cut, or even bathe a human body. And nowhere was this more pronounced than in the practice of bloodletting. To bleed someone was not simply a matter of urgency. It was an art, timed with celestial precision. Medieval physicians relied on bleeding calendars, vivid illustrations that aligned parts of the body with the movements of the stars and planets. These charts mapped the human form against the zodiac, each sign governing a particular region. Aries the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on, down to Pisces, which ruled the feet. For example, you would never bleed someone's arm while the moon was in Gemini. That could cause madness or sudden death. If Mars was ascendant in a patient's ruling house, the blood might rebel. The phase of the moon, the position of Saturn, even the hour of day all mattered. The goal was to maintain the balance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Let too much blood during the wrong alignment, and you might not restore balance. You might tip it further toward death. Bloodletting was done with lancets, knives, or by attaching leeches, although leeches were considered less precise, more rural. A well-trained surgeon would cut into a vein at the inner elbow, behind the knee, or even into the temples. In some cases, they opened the back of the neck or the ankles. Patients were sometimes bled weekly, others monthly, to refresh the spirits. The blood was caught in bowls, often marked with measurements and examined. Dark blood, possibly too much black bile. Frothy blood, trouble in the lungs. Bleeding calendars were painted on church walls, copied into medical manuscripts, and hung in apothecaries. Some were so richly illustrated that they resembled devotional works, and in a way they were. This was medicine as divine navigation, reading the stars to navigate the human vessel. Of course, many patients died from the treatment, but in the medieval mind, it wasn't the bleeding that killed them. It was the failure to time it correctly. In the late Middle Ages, societal norms were deeply shaped by superstition, rigid religious doctrine, and a limited understanding of medicine, science, and psychology. As a result, some customs and incidents appear bizarre, even surreal, by modern standards. One particularly strange phenomenon was the dancing plague of 1518 in Strasbourg, part of the Holy Roman Empire. In this event, dozens, eventually hundreds, of people began to dance uncontrollably in the streets over the course of several weeks. Contemporary accounts describe men and women collapsing from exhaustion, some dying of strokes or heart attacks, all seemingly compelled by an invisible force. Authorities, baffled and frightened, believed the cause was supernatural or astrological. In a misguided attempt to treat the epidemic, the city even hired musicians to accompany the dancers, hoping structured rhythm would purge the affliction. Today, scholars speculate it may have been a case of mass psychogenic illness, possibly triggered by famine, ergot poisoning, or collective trauma. However, no definitive explanation exists, and it remains one of the strangest unexplained events of the late medieval period. Another striking custom was trial by ordeal, which, though declining by the 1300s, still held influence in rural areas. People accused of crimes could be subjected to physical trials believed to reveal divine judgment. One such ordeal involved plunging the accused's hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If the burn healed cleanly within a few days, the accused was deemed innocent. Another involved walking over red-hot ploughshares. These trials were often presided over by clergy and were seen as sacred processes. While officially banned by the Church in the early 13th century, especially after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, variants persisted in parts of Europe well into the late medieval period, particularly where local customs held sway over centralized law. One of the most disturbing yet widely accepted practices in late medieval Europe was corpse medicine, the belief that the bodies of the dead, particularly those of martyrs or executed criminals, held curative powers. Human fat was used in balms, ground skulls were mixed into tinctures, and blood from the freshly executed was sometimes drunk as a supposed remedy for epilepsy. This was not a fringe behaviour. It was endorsed by some physicians and scholars. Mummy powder, for example, was harvested from embalmed corpses imported from the Middle East and ground into a substance called mumia, believed to treat internal bleeding and bruises. Apothecaries sold it openly. Some even sold bones from European graves, passing them off as ancient relics. While the practice was more heavily documented during the early modern period, its origins trace clearly to late medieval medical traditions, especially as Black Death outbreaks and battlefield injuries left a surplus of dead bodies and heightened desperation for cures. The consumption of human remains as medicine reveals not only the medical ignorance of the time, but also the extent to which death permeated daily life, collapsing the boundary between corpse and cure. Equally bizarre were sumptuary laws, particularly in England, France and Italy, which legally restricted what people could wear based on their social rank. These laws were not merely recommendations, they were enforced through fines and public shaming. The aim was to preserve the visual hierarchy of feudal society, ensuring that lower classes could not dress like the nobility. In practice, this meant that a butcher could not wear velvet, a merchant could not wear ermine, and no one beneath a baron could wear gold thread or purple. In some cities, there were even restrictions on the length of shoe points and the width of sleeves. These laws often descended into absurdity, requiring constant updates to account for evolving fashion. In Florence, for instance, a woman could be fined for wearing a silk ribbon if her husband had not paid his guild dues. Enforcement was uneven, but the laws remained on the books for centuries and were an ongoing source of social tension, particularly during and after the Black Death, when rising wages gave peasants and merchants access to wealth and fabric that had previously been reserved for the elite. An especially eerie practice found in parts of Central and Eastern Europe during the late Middle Ages was anti-vampire burials. These were ritual responses to what was believed to be posthumous unrest, bodies that did not decay properly, corpses found in bloated or bloodied condition, or rumours of dead villagers rising from the grave. Suspected revenants were exhumed and mutilated. Their heads might be cut off and placed between their legs. Bricks or stones were sometimes placed in their mouths to prevent chewing. Stakes were driven through the chest or abdomen, and in some cases, the corpse was reburied face down or burned entirely. This practice was most prominent in the Balkans and Slavic territories, but was not limited to them. Archaeological discoveries in Poland and Bohemia have confirmed these customs through grave sites containing bound skeletons and vampire prevention implements. These burial traditions reflected widespread belief in supernatural explanations for disease, sudden death, and nocturnal terror, especially during periods of recurring plague when fear and mortality were omnipresent. Among the more peculiar rituals of the late Middle Ages was the practice of sin-eating, a custom most associated with rural parts of Britain, especially Wales and the border regions, though similar ideas appeared elsewhere in Europe. A sin-eater was a poor individual, often a social outcast, who was paid a small sum to consume food and drink placed on or near the corpse of the deceased. The belief was that the food absorbed the sins of the dead person's soul, and by eating it, the sin-eater would take on those spiritual burdens, allowing the deceased to pass into the afterlife cleansed. The meal often consisted of bread and ale, sometimes with salt or herbs, and was eaten in solemn silence. Sin-eaters were not thanked, they were not honoured. They were both necessary and reviled, believed to carry the weight of countless unconfessed transgressions. No priest endorsed the practice. It was strictly folk religion, born from communities that feared an unshriven soul might return. Sin-eaters were often buried at crossroads, far from consecrated ground, their own spiritual fate uncertain and deliberately unmarked. And then there was the phenomenon of corpse weddings, a ritual not common but certainly documented in parts of late medieval and early modern Europe, particularly where dynastic inheritance or moral panic was involved. In these ceremonies, a recently deceased person, most often a man, would be symbolically married to a living bride. The reasons varied. Sometimes it was to secure inheritance lines, sometimes to preserve social honour, and occasionally, in cases of betrothed couples separated by sudden death, to complete what had been promised. The church was never a formal part of these rituals, but local priests might be pressured to witness them. Rings were exchanged, vows spoken over the corpse, and sometimes the body was dressed in wedding clothes. These ceremonies were often secretive, accompanied by whispers and unease, and were sometimes followed by the burial of the body in a wedding shroud. While rare, the very fact that such events occurred, and were taken seriously, speaks to the deep intersection of death, duty, and communal fear in medieval society. Another disturbing tradition came from within the church itself: monastic punishments and self-mortification. In some monastic orders, particularly the more austere Benedictine and Cistercian communities, physical punishment was part of daily discipline. Monks who broke silence, made errors in chants, or were found guilty of pride might be whipped in front of the others during chapter meetings. These flagellations were carried out in silence, sometimes by the monk himself, sometimes by a superior. More extreme forms included wearing hair shirts, garments made of coarse animal hair, worn next to the skin to induce constant discomfort. iron girdles, or even sleeping in chains. Some monks voluntarily refused to speak for years, or ate only ashes and water during Lent. While these practices were meant to imitate the suffering of Christ and encourage humility, they also reflected a theology deeply preoccupied with the physical body as a site of both punishment and purification. In the popular imagination, castles are symbols of grandeur, romance, or royal power. But in the Middle Ages, particularly during the 13th to 15th centuries, castles were above all instruments of survival. They were not luxurious palaces, but practical fortresses designed by anxious men in anxious times. Their construction was a response to instability, invasions, rebellions, dynastic wars, and local feuds. Nearly every architectural detail was a reflection of paranoia. The outer curtain wall wasn't just to repel siege weapons. It was often angled to deflect projectiles, with towers spaced at precise intervals to prevent blind spots. Gatehouses were death traps by design. The portcullis could fall at both ends, trapping enemies in a killing corridor where arrows rained from murder holes above. Some even included boiling oil chutes or stone drop slots hidden behind sculpted gargoyles. Inside, the rooms were not cosy. They were cramped, draughty, and often dark. Windows, when present, were little more than slits, impossible to squeeze through, difficult to aim into. Stairs spiraled clockwise, not for elegance, but because most defenders were right-handed. This gave them the advantage on the downward swing, while climbing attackers struggled. Toilets or guardrobes were built to drop straight into moats or cesspits, and were often positioned as a weak point, where attackers might crawl up from below. Builders compensated with garderobe chutes, lined with iron bars. Some castles had false doors, hidden rooms, and escape tunnels, insurance against betrayal from within, which was often more feared than attack from without. Even the central keep, supposedly the safest area, was designed for last stands. Its food storage was generous not for feasting, but for sieges that could last months. And yet, despite all this, many castles were still taken, not through brute force but starvation, bribery, or internal treachery. Medieval castles were not built for peace. They were built for siege, surveillance, and the slow anticipation of violence. Every stone, slot, and shadow was part of a system built not for luxury, but for dread. The concept of prison in the late Middle Ages was not synonymous with punishment. It was a temporary condition, a holding pattern, a limbo space between accusation and judgment. People were not usually sentenced to prison. They were placed in prison until their fate was decided: death, payment, exile, or release. As such, medieval prisons were not correctional institutions. They were architectural afterthoughts, damp, airless, and often invisible. Most prisons were simply rooms, cells carved beneath castles, towers, or city halls. There were no bars, just stone, chains, and heavy doors. The most infamous of these spaces were oubliettes, derived from the French oublier, to forget. These were vertical shafts where prisoners were dropped and left, sometimes for days, sometimes for life. Food might be lowered on a rope, or not. The point was to disappear the prisoner, physically and symbolically. Conditions were abysmal. Sanitation was non-existent. Prisoners defecated where they slept. Chains were often bolted to the walls. Light was minimal, if present at all. Disease was constant. In many cases, survival depended not on guards, but on family or friends, bringing food through narrow grates. Guards themselves were corruptible, easily bribed to provide extra rations, reduce restraints, or deliver messages. Imprisonment was deeply class-dependent. Nobles, if captured, might be held in relatively clean castle chambers, often with a servant or two and their own bedding. Peasants, by contrast, might be shackled in communal pits, with little distinction between thief, debtor, heretic, or murderer. Torture was not an everyday function of prison life, but it was a sanctioned feature, especially under inquisitorial or civic courts. Devices such as thumbscrews, racks and strapados were used to extract confessions. These were not punishments, they were procedures. There were no rites, no appeals, no presumption of innocence. Drawing and quartering was the most extreme form, used primarily for treason in England. The process involved hanging the traitor until nearly dead, then disemboweling them while still alive, followed by beheading and cutting the body into 4 pieces, which were displayed at the gates of cities. It was rare, but when done, it was meant to be remembered. Executions were public for a reason. They reaffirmed power, deterred rebellion, and channeled communal fear. Children were brought to watch. Bread was sold at the gallows. In some places, executions were followed by feasts or sermons. The state did not whisper, it shouted, and the scaffold remained standing long after the body had fallen. One of the most horrifying and utterly fabricated accusations of the late medieval world was the blood libel, the claim that Jewish communities kidnapped and murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals. The accusation had no basis in Jewish law, theology, or practice. It was a myth born of hatred, ignorance, and fear. Yet it took hold with deadly force. The first recorded case occurred in Norwich, England, in 1144, but it exploded in frequency during the 13th to 15th centuries, particularly during times of plague or economic instability. These false accusations often began with a missing or murdered Christian child. With no clear suspect, the blame turned toward the local Jewish quarter. Claims would surface, witnesses saying they saw strange behaviour, or children claiming to have escaped mysterious rituals. Once the rumour took root, it spread like fire. Trials followed. Torture extracted confessions. Entire communities were executed. In 1475, in the city of Trent, a 2-year-old boy named Simon was found dead, and local Jews were accused of killing him in a mock crucifixion. Despite obvious signs of coercion and a complete lack of evidence, 17 Jews were executed, and young Simon was declared a martyr and venerated for centuries. The Church officially denounced the blood libel several times. Popes issued bulls condemning it, but local authorities often ignored them. The accusations served a purpose. They justified violence, expelled communities, and erased debts owed to Jewish lenders. The blood libel was not merely a lie, it was a tool. Its effects were long-lasting. For centuries it remained embedded in folklore, art and public memory. Even today, echoes of it linger. It is among the most dangerous myths Europe ever invented because it combined horror, sanctity, and paranoia into a single, unforgettable lie. To end, we return to a moment so grotesque and politically deranged that it reads like satire, but is entirely true. In 897 CE, in Rome, Pope Stephen VI ordered the trial of his dead predecessor, Pope Formosus. The motive was political revenge. Formosus had supported the wrong faction in a power struggle, and though he had already been buried for 9 months, Stephen wanted not just to condemn him, he wanted to humiliate him. So Formosus was exhumed, dressed in papal vestments, and propped up on a throne in the Lateran Basilica. His body was decaying, blackened, and eyeless. A deacon stood beside the corpse to answer on his behalf, while Stephen, frothing with fury, read out charges of perjury, illegally assuming office, and violating church law. The outcome was predetermined. The corpse was found guilty, its papal robes were torn off, its 3 fingers of blessing cut away, and it was thrown into the Tiber River. This event, now known as the Cadaver Synod, was so shocking that it caused widespread riots. Stephen VI was arrested and strangled in prison not long after. Later popes reversed the verdict. Formosus's body was retrieved from the river and reburied with honours. Yet the event left a permanent stain. For years afterward, the papal throne was viewed with deep suspicion. It marked a moment when the church itself descended into the absurd, when law became theatre, and death was no escape from politics. The Middle Ages did not end with reason. They ended with spectacle, and in some ways they never entirely left us. Thank you for trudging through the muck and marrow of the Middle Ages with me. You've wandered the alleys of plague and prayer, stood beneath gallows, and heard the whispers of bones beneath the churchyard sod. Now the torches dim, the tolling bells fade, and the village grows quiet. Rest well, weary traveller.